No, I mean, architecture is political. We gotta add that stuff.
Indeed.
We're tearing down communities to build multifamily, and you have to understand we are creating displacement. You're displacing Black and brown folks, and they don't come back.
Half of this podcast would be dedicated to the history of Tyler House, my journey and my discoveries, and hey, I'm going to solve this housing problem.
Hey guys, what's up? My name is Melissa Daniels. This is the Architecture is Political podcast where Black and brown folks talk about architecture. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and be part of my storytelling. Happy New Year, everyone. Happy 2025. This episode will be the last episode of season 4. I thought that ending it with Peter D. Cook, FAIA NOMA, is a great way to wrap up this season. A little bit about Peter. He is the design principal and vice president of HGA, a position he held since joining the firm in 2017. A graduate of Harvard and Columbia University. He's a nationally recognized architect based in Washington, D.C. with an amazing award-winning portfolio. He is the descendant of Julian F. Abel, one of the nation's most celebrated and accomplished African-American architects. Peter served as one of the 3 lead design collaborators for the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Peter was also appointed by President Biden to be a member of the U.S. Commissioner of Fine Arts, and he was elevated as a fellow in 2022. He also sits on the board of trustees at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, and of course, he's a member of the National Organization of Minority Architects. Peter, as I mentioned in his bio, comes from a very rich history that resonates here in the DMV. One of the reasons I invited him on is to talk about DC and how he is part of that changing landscape. One of the things that stuck to me, besides his amazing lineage, the memorials, as well as libraries that he has designed. Now, I'm doing this thing called Black Architects That Built DC. And another reason why I invited him on is to really understand how I'm going to take this approach. So, in the second episode, because there's only 2 episodes I've done so far, in the second episode, I've highlighted DC public libraries and I've excluded him out on purpose. And we talked about this as to why I excluded him. And now I'm including him. I just have to make some visits to some libraries and create a video on that. And of course, I will post it and let you know. Another thing that we talked about was students, architecture students out there, and how tuition, oh my God, tuition is a Cybertruck prior to its depreciating values. But it's a lot of money out there. So we talked about that. Oh, and speaking of Thomas Jefferson Foundation, we talked about in depth of the work that he has done at Monticello. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, as well as the conclusion of season 4. And season 5 is coming up soon. Thanks. Hi, Peter.
Good evening, I guess we'll say, right?
It could be evening, morning, noon.
That's the beauty of these podcasts.
On your way to work, on your way to walking or picking up your dog. Thank you for listening. Peter, like I mentioned, prior to me hitting record, I'm a little nervous talking to you. And I don't know why. Only other times I ever get nervous is if I don't know the person. This is a cold contact. And I have no idea how the interview would go. But I feel like I know you don't know you. And that's because you've been in my ear earlier with a previous podcast that you've done like back in 2021, as well as me looking you up. So I feel like I know you, but at the same time, it's like, it's the first time of us talking to each other.
There's no reason to be nervous in front of me. Not this person.
Would you consider yourself a Washingtonian?
Yes, I would. I have a long family history here in Washington, D.C. So I certainly would say that Washington was always a second home to me growing up. I grew up in Detroit, but my parents both grew up here in Washington, D.C. And I had a lot of family and friends and cousins who are here in D.C. So it was always a second home. But I've lived here now for, over 30 years now. So it certainly is home. I will say this, that I always remember years ago asking my father about how he left Washington, D.C. all those many years, 1957, to go to not even Detroit, but to Pontiac, Michigan. And my question was something to the effect of, Dad, you grew up in Washington, D.C. Your parents are in Washington, D.C. My mother's parents are in D.C. She's from D.C. You both went to Dunbar High School and so on. My father finished Georgetown Law School, I think again in 1957 or something like that. And they got married. And I said, walk me through the thought process. Why did you leave this home as you were just starting out your life, your adult life, to move to Pontiac, Michigan? And as soon as he told me the answer, I thought to myself, I should have known that. And the answer was, he said, well, take yourself back to 1957. He said, no one was interviewing, let alone hiring, an African-American with a law degree. So you went where the job was. And he just happened to have an uncle who was a physician in Pontiac, Michigan, who happened to know an African-American attorney at the time who was looking for a law clerk. So he got a 1-year law clerk position with an attorney in Pontiac, Michigan, and the two of them packed their bags and moved from the city that they knew, Washington, D.C., to Pontiac, Michigan. And they often said that, how much they really enjoyed life in Washington, D.C., but at the same time, it was nice to be able to kind of get out and establish their own lives in a new place. So anyway, with that background, it's nice to always be able to come back here and now establish this as my home.
I too am a DC native, and I've seen the changes that DC has undertaken, both good and bad. Unfortunately, my career has not lended me to actually build or design in DC per se. I've done little things, but not to change the fabric or be a participant in changing the fabric of DC. You have. How has designing influenced you for the past 30 years? How do you approach your design intent and the community themselves?
Well, you mentioned a word that is always front and center when I begin working on projects, and that is community. One of the things, maybe it's a bit of a cliche, I don't know, but I'm very proud of it, is that I actually take the time to listen to what people have to say before. I mean, we architects always love to start sketching on day one. And I have to resist that temptation to do that because it's not the right thing to do. You've got to sit down and listen to what the client is saying, but just as much, you've got to listen to what the community is saying. I remember many years ago, there was a project we began, which was the design of the Dorothy Height Benning Library. And there was a lot that had happened that preceded our involvement on the project. And it was very clear in the community sessions that we'd had that the community really just wanted to kind of get things off their chest. And we might be talking about how we were going to approach the design or what was important to us. We wanted to hear from them and so on. But the bottom line is they just weren't in that position to hear that at that point. So we spent the first 2 or 3 community meetings just listening to what they had to say. And I think that because of that, it allowed us to be able to then turn around and develop a design that really spoke to what they were looking for. And I think that, projects like that, projects like the Shaw Library that we also did, really, really benefited from those interactions. That was a number of years ago. Fast forward to other projects we were doing. We just completed the Lamond Riggs Library as well. And that was one of those projects which really, again, benefited greatly from listening to the community. And again, that's critical for what we're doing. Now, I've been blessed to be able to work on any number of different projects around this country and beyond. And I still take that same approach because people want to be heard, and it's an opportunity for people to express their goals and desires. And it's our responsibility to be able to translate that in built form.
I'm glad you mentioned libraries. I'm doing a series called Black Architects That Build DC. I started off with Eastland Garden. I did not know that existed, and I was tickled to find out that it did. And then the second one I did was DC Public Libraries. I came across Daniel Shaw. I knew Davis, Brody, Bond were the architects. Shout out to J. Max Bond Jr.
My mentor for 20 years. Yeah.
And I excluded essentially you
You're excused. You're excused.
out of the list because following Eastland and following the other libraries, David Adajay and Phil Freelon, those were Black architecture firms. And Davis Brody Bond was a third as far as I searched.
A third in ownership. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I struggled. And as I talked to other individuals, other architects about this dilemma, and it's a dilemma, although it may not be, I just need to recategorize it. And this is where it gets long because the Black firm is dwindling. It wasn't how it used to be.
Correct.
And I was using that as a base. So now everything is kind of muddy. So even if I do have a Black firm, there are partnerships with other firms that, let's say the convention center is a perfect example where I know at the time Deborah Purnell did portions of that.
Exactly, right.
But they weren't the main firm that did that work. So what do I do? Should I go with the architect of record?
You mentioned Max Bond.
Yeah.
And there are certain stories that I always remember about Max, but one of which is that he said to me that if an architect ever tells you that I and I alone designed this building, you know that they're lying. Because it was his belief, it's my belief, that there's no one person or no one entity is exactly responsible for the entire project, especially a large, complex project like the convention center, for example, that you mentioned. It could be a smaller project, which you're collaborating on as well. But there are so many people who are involved in these projects. And I think, it's important to acknowledge that fact and often to acknowledge that different firms have different roles on projects, right? I guess I would suggest that the way you frame it is really more about inclusion rather than exclusion. Even though you may have two firms or three or as I've experienced, 4 firms on a particular project, it doesn't mean that you've got to pick one, because I think all of them are contributing, or should be at least contributing, to the end product.
So then it won't be any Black architects then.
Why do you say that? Yeah.
Let's say Smith Group, for example.
Sure.
And they have some very talented Black architects on staff. What if one of them led a project? Smith Group is not a Black firm. How would I even know who this person is? Because I do want to give this person credit. But at the same time, it's like, they're not a Black firm. I don't know how to approach this, acknowledge their work, but at the same time, it's not a predominantly Black firm.
But you're elevating the firm, the corporation, that entity over the individual.
I am. Yes, I am.
I would suggest that you ought to focus on the individual, that Black architect at firm A, B, or C, and celebrate his or her talents that they bring to these projects.
But should I go like the architect of record? Should I go?
I'll give you another example.
Okay.
I am so honored to be the great-grandnephew of one of the most accomplished, I'm going to say architects, just period, that this country has seen. Certainly an African-American architect. His name is Julian Francis Abel. And he was by any measures, an extraordinary talent. All you have to do is look at the drawings that he did, the renderings that he did, and the buildings that he did to know that. And among his buildings that he did were the Free Library in Philadelphia, the Museum of Art in Philadelphia, all of Duke University. He did a couple buildings right here in Washington, D.C., the Belgian ambassador's residence, the Argentine embassy. He worked for 30 years as the chief designer for a firm in Philadelphia, Horace Trumbauer. Parentheses, when Trumbauer passed away in 1938, Julian Abel and a colleague took over the firm until Julian Abel passed in 1950. I'm bringing this up because Julian Abel was African-American, Julian Abel was extraordinarily talented, and Julian Abel did not own the firm at all. So should we kind of say, well, yeah, there's Julian, but he didn't own the firm, so we can't really put him at the top of the pedestal. I say Julian Abel was an extraordinary talent, and let's celebrate the talent that he brought to every single project he did, irrespective of whose name was on the door. Now, in this particular case, I will give credit to Horace Trumbauer. He was, in many ways, you could argue, very courageous for, at the turn of the century, turning over these prized commissions to a young African-American architect. But Trumbauer recognized talent when he saw it. So I would suggest that you do celebrate the African-American owned firm today, because I once had one of those firms, and I'll tell you this, it's tough. So it is tough on anybody, and especially with African-American architects. But I still think that just stripping that away and focusing on the talent that people bring to the projects and to their craft is going to be really important.
There's a registry out there, the Directory of African American.
Correct. Right.
That's out there. Should I just go in that and look for all the registered architects there and look for, hey, did you ever work on any projects in DC? It doesn't matter what it is. Like, I mean, I'm serious.
It's
like,
not bad, wouldn't be a bad start to do that.
And should I go after like the architect of record too? Like how?
I guess it depends on what you're looking for. So, for example, often, certainly not always, but often when there are, say, two firms working on a project together, there is an architect of record. And then often the other side of that coin is that there's a design architect. Is your purpose to find who is actually the author of the design? So in that case, you'd be able to look for the design architect. If you're looking for somebody who is actually kind of the principal, the one who's kind of steering the whole ship and moving it forward and owning and having the ultimate responsibility for it, then often you'll look for the architect of record. So I guess it really depends on what you're looking to discern through this research. So I would focus less on the title, or just look at the talent that somebody brings to the project.
All right. I'll add you to the list again.
You got it. Thank you.
The Lamont Riggs, that's on Riggs Road, right?
That's on South Dakota Avenue.
Oh, yeah. Across from Fort Totten Station. Not too far from there.
Correct. That's correct.
Okay. So you've been appointed to the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Did you apply? Did someone encourage you to apply? Did they email you saying congratulations? Was there a phone call? Have you met Biden yet? Like, what?
It's actually a funny story. No, I did not apply for it, anything like that. So take yourself back a few years. This is what, 2021? The whole country is in the middle of COVID, right? And so many of us were able to work from home, as I was. We had a technological system at the office where, in the event I got a phone call that was in the physical office, it would then be automatically transcribed, and an audio recording would be an attachment, and it would be sent as an email to me. The email was not the typical looking email, so to speak. It had a bunch of numbers and some weird URL, and I'm sitting at home and I get this weird looking email, and in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have clicked it because it probably looked like some sort of spam. and our IT department probably would be tisking me for having opened this thing. But I did. And I clicked on this audio recording, and it was kind of a poor recording. It kind of went in and out and so on. And the woman who left a voicemail had this somewhat unusual sounding name. And she mentioned something in passing, and it was kind of cloudy. I couldn't hear about Office of Presidential something like that. And then she said, could you call me back at your earliest convenience? And she rattled off this number, but the voicemail actually ended before the last digit of the phone number.
So did you think it was spam?
Well, I wasn't sure what to make of it at all. I joke a little bit that I have an in-house counsel in that my wife is an attorney, and she was in the next room, and she used to work for the federal government. And I called her in. I said, hey, could you listen to this thing? So I played it for her a couple of times. And she said, I think what she's saying is something about the Office of Presidential Personnel. I said, Peter, that's a real thing. She says, my guess is that somebody is applying for a position with the White House and is using you as a reference. I had the exact same reaction as you did. That makes perfect sense. So she said, well, why don't you call her back and talk? So I did. I called her back, and she said, thank you very much for, and by the way, I talked about how she left off the last digit in the voicemail. Well, in that URL, I talked about how it was rattling, it had all these numbers. That was the number. So the mystery was solved that was the telephone number to call back. So I called her back, and she said, well, thank you very much for calling back so quickly. I wanted to let you know that your name is being floated for a position on the Commission of Fine Arts. And A, are you okay with that? And B, if so, can we begin a background check? And I had to pick myself off the floor. And once I did, I said, I'd be excited to be considered for that. And so I guess I'll say the rest is history.
Did you meet Biden?
I have not. I do have a certificate that actually memorializes that I actually am a commissioner on the Commission of Fine Arts.
How often do you guys meet?
We meet once a month. We meet every third Thursday of a month. There are two exceptions to that. One is in August and one is in December. So outside of August and December, we meet once a month. And it has been an absolute joy to be part of this process.
I checked out the list of your cohorts, and it looks like you have a fabulous group of people. You get to zoom in, as I'm assuming it's zoom in to talk about projects.
Yeah, it's what's also interesting is that as I go about my daily life here in Washington, D.C., as I walk around the National Mall or the Wharf or the Shaw neighborhood or wherever I am, I find myself looking around and saying, oh, yes, we reviewed a project over here. And oh, yeah, what about this project over here? And so on. And so it's been really professionally and personally rewarding to be able to know that, to be aware of my surroundings and be aware of some of the things that are being planned and designed around town, but also to know that I could have the opportunity to opine on how to make these designs that much better. We have to resist the temptation, and I think we're very good at it, in recognizing we're not the architects. The applicant is the architect. And so we offer suggestions to say, have you considered this? Have you thought about this? What about that? As opposed to, well, I would have done it this way. It's trying to guide people towards a better solution. And again, I think that's been quite rewarding for me personally and professionally.
Let's fast forward to a project that you did, a place of remembrance at Monticello.
Yeah.
Your office designed that. For the audience's sake, can you just describe it?
Well, for those of you who have been to Monticello, for those of you who have not, please go. It's an extraordinary place. And you just feel the weight of history when you go there. When we were approached about this project, it's really two projects in one. One was I'll say sort of a restoration of the burial ground. And I'll get into that in a second. And the other one was the insertion of a new space that they called the Contemplative Site. So the burial ground, let's start there. When you arrive at Monticello, you will, for the most part, probably arrive at the visitor center. The visitor center has a series of parking trays, kind of landscape parking trays that are near there. One would be forgiven if you got out of your car and raced right up to the visitor center and did what you do at visitor centers, and then you take this little shuttle bus up to the mountaintop where Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, actually is. But sandwiched in between all of these little parking spots is a burial site, unremarkable to the eye, but remarkable to descendants. But it's a place where an estimated 45 enslaved persons were buried. There are no tombstones or anything like that. But the idea was that so many people completely bypass this, that it becomes something that is completely forgotten and overlooked. And so the goal of this was to make sure that the burial ground becomes an integral part of the experience of visiting Monticello, that you cannot look away from it. And so this was a way of just trying to make sure that when you either get out of your car and make your way up to the visitor center, and or when you come back after visiting the mountaintop, that you think about the lives of the enslaved and what they did to make sure that Monticello actually could happen. So that's at the burial ground. So we restored the burial ground, it created a new fence and created a pathway that allowed people to meander around the perimeter of it. That's the short version of what the burial ground is. Now, the second part of this is the contemplative site. Again, for those of you who have been to Monticello, they offer several wonderful tours there, the house tour, the garden tour, slavery tour. And there's a lot of heavy stuff that is discussed there. And so they wanted to create a space at the mountaintop that allows the visitor to take in all of this, to come to his or her own conclusions. So it's kind of a non-didactic space, but a place where you can be by yourself or with your friends or family that you've visited with, to think about all that you've heard there and to be able to process this information about the 607 enslaved people who made Monticello work. It was not initially intended to be a memorial per se, but I think in some ways people are looking at it that way. But we worked very closely with the descendant community. Now, we were talking earlier during this conversation about the importance of listening. And I think there were any number of projects where I can say that was really critical. This is so important to be able to sit down with descendants and hear their stories and understand what this space means to them. And so together with them, together with an outstanding landscape architecture firm, Nelson Bird Woltz, we crafted this design which remembers, again, the 607 enslaved persons who made Monticello possible. So it's a place where you can sit by yourself. You can look out at this wall, which is about 60 feet in length. It's made of Corten steel. And in fact, you can see in some of the photographs how Corten, by very nature, tends to stain. And so I remember when we were opening it, when it was finally opened, I was talking with one of the descendants who gave me the great compliment saying that it was very clear from the design that we actually did listen to the descendant community and what they were looking for. And he asked me specifically about the materiality. Why did you choose Corten steel? And there were any number of reasons why, but one of which was I said, that I told him that Corten steel stains, and sometimes it's hard to get that stain out. And I said, that's really symbolic in many ways of the original sin of this country. We've got something that so many people are afraid to discuss, and we can't really, we don't confront these issues as a society here in the United States like we should. And so there's this indelible stain in this country that we try to get out, but we can't get out. And so the fact that this is a Corten steel wall that will stain is part of that thought process. Those sorts of ideas would not have been possible were it not for our many interactions with the descendant community.
How long was from conception to build?
I don't know, but it was a long time. I mean, you think that a project of this size, it's not a big project per se, but you'd think that, shouldn't take long to do that, right? But again, sitting down and listening took a long time, and iterating over, different ways of how we want to think about this design. I mean, I have any number of sketches we did and mock-ups we did that don't look anything like this. Okay, case in point is when we began the design of the contemplative site, it's on a mountain. So the mountain slopes. One of the issues we were wrestling with was, how do we make this as accessible as possible? A number of people have mobility issues, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't excluding a group of people as we were memorializing a group of people who were excluded from all that America has to offer. So we really were struggling with that, and finally came up with a design that was better in terms of accessibility, but still really didn't meet that moment. So we worked with the client, and we actually shifted the site about, I don't know, maybe 100 feet, 150 feet up the hill to the site where it currently is built right now. And it is a much better site. It is much more accessible and works in some of the long-range planning that's being done to make sure that the mountaintop is even more accessible than it is today.
Those type of projects, I can take an emotional toll on you, right? Like you talking to these descendants and you being reminded, talking about political, right? You being reminded of the policies of this country. How did you handle that? All knowing what your descendants went through in their professions and how they were able to overcome those challenges.
I also try to lead with empathy. And I know that's something that is central to what we do at HGA. But in this project, that really came into play. And for a variety of reasons, it came into play. But one of which is that there was a oral history that we had in our family that really made me connect with the story of the descendant community when what they were talking about. And the story I have is that as a kid, we always heard about, gosh, I'm going to get this wrong, but it was I'm going to rattle off a few great grand aunt, not grandmother, but grand aunt, Alethea Tanner. Alethea Tanner. We always heard the story that she was born enslaved in Prince George's County, and that she was illiterate, but determined. And she had apparently a vegetable garden. And apparently the oral history was that she sold vegetables in what is now Lafayette Square, right across from what is now the White House. And she, through the sale of her vegetables, she was actually able to buy her own freedom. And the oral history was that one of her regular customers, was a gentleman named Thomas Jefferson. Now, it's a great story. I don't know whether, who knew whether that was true, but, it probably was true, but we had no proof of that. The other thing I'll say about Alethea Tanner is that she didn't stop with her own freedom. She then went on to facilitate the freedom, the purchase of the freedom of, I think, 16 or maybe even 18 of her nieces and nephews. A truly, truly remarkable story of a hero. So as we were designing this project, we had some consultations with some of the historians at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. And they found presented me with a document that showed that Thomas Jefferson had an invoice for medical services for, I will simply say, people in his employ. And it turns out that her name was written on this list of Thomas Jefferson's quote unquote servants. So there we had actual proof that my great whatever grand aunt, Alethea Tanner, was in face-to-face communication with Thomas Jefferson. So when you have a story like that that resonates deeply with you, and you know that you're also speaking with descendants who also have a story similar to that, where they know that their descendants were walking the same grounds as Thomas Jefferson, that goes a long way to making that connection.
Wow. Your lineage is insane.
Yeah, it's I will say I'm not a religious person per se, but I do feel very blessed.
Yeah.
To be able to to recall those stories and to have that family history that I can speak to. And I know that there are so many families of all stripes that don't have that ability to recall and those specific stories about what their family members were doing a generation or 2 or 5 or 10 ago. And so I find myself very uniquely privileged in that regard to be able to know my people, to know where they came from and to know these stories, and frankly, often have photos of people. There's actually a silhouette of Lethia Tanner.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. That's strength.
It really is. Yeah.
Wow.
And I know how fortunate I am to have that.
Lastly, I want to talk about what I found out recently blew my mind. Let me tell you. I found out that NYU tuition is $100,000.
$100,000. Yep.
That blew my mind. And usually going to architecture school is a tad bit more. I don't know. I'm not for sure for NYU, but there are some schools. I for a brief stint, I went to Catholic University, and their architecture school was more than the average tuition of the university. So, 2 things. How was your education? If you remember how much that cost, that'll be a bonus. But also, these kids are coming out with like $500,000 debt. How do we in the profession handle this? I was blown away, and I started thinking about what these kids have to pay back. Because I know for sure they're not going to start out making $100K when as an intern.
It's a huge issue. And I think if I had the answer to that, I might be, I don't know, running for president or something like that.
You have the lineage to run for president. You can do that, Peter.
No, I don't. But thank you anyway. But no, it's a problem that this country has. It's a problem that this industry has for exactly the reasons you talked about. I will say I grew up as a middle-class kid. My parents always said to me, find something you love. If you love it, you'll probably be good at it. And if you're good at it, the rest will fall into place. And they kept hammering that. I think that's fabulous advice. And, my grandfather was sort of a deputy campus architect at Howard University his whole career. We used to visit him from Detroit to Washington, D.C., and I'd hang out with him in his basement and he'd show me all these drawings. And thought it was really, I mentioned about Julian Abel before, and when we went to Philadelphia, we'd look at his buildings. And so I was really inspired by all of that. And I really thought, maybe this architecture thing is for me. And so I studied. I went to, as I was beginning to think about colleges, like many fledgling architects, I thought, do I want to go to a 5-year Bachelor of Architecture program or something else? And I was set up with an architect back in Detroit to ask these questions, get me some advice on this. And I remember he said to me that at age 16, he said, I'm guessing, Peter, that you probably don't really, really, really know whether or not you want to be an architect. He said, my advice to you is to get yourself a good liberal arts degree. Study anything and everything. Study economics, study literature, study biology, study whatever you want, and just absorb the world. And if at the end of 4 years you decide that architecture is for you, then go to graduate school. That was something that worked for me. And I'm not saying should be the rule for everybody, not at all, but it worked for me. Now, to your question about cost, that was a decision that stayed with me for many, many, many years after I finished. I will simply say that. But it still goes back to your question about how do people afford these things? And I had a conversation about that story I just told you with a colleague of mine, and he gently reminded me that is a path that is not open to everybody, because I just described a 7-year path, whereas the first path, the Bachelor of Architecture, was a 5-year path. That, as you said, when you were kind of talking about the dollars and cents of education, that's a lot of dollars and cents. So it's a deep, deep challenge that we're going to have to figure out in this industry.
So why architecture?
For me?
Yeah.
My architecture?
Why architecture?
Why not?
I mean, you could have went the lawyer route, right? You could have done that.
I could have.
There was precedent.
I think architecture tends to skip generations in my family. My son is said to me, my 28-year-old son said to me some time ago, Dad, I don't think I want to be an architect. I said, well, I kind of predicted that. So maybe that means I'll have a grandchild who will be an architect. I don't know. But why architecture? I'll go back to another story that my grandfather told me. My grandfather, Julian Abel Cook Sr. And I have a lot of lawyers in my family, so no disrespect to lawyers or doctors, and as you'll hear in the story. But he said to me that when you go see a doctor, and this is playing a little bit fast and loose with some facts here, but he said when you go see a doctor, you usually go because there's a problem. I've got this ache in my shoulder, or there's this whatever, and can you fix this? Can you help me get through this? When you go see an attorney, maybe you've also got a problem. Hey, I haven't paid my taxes in the last 20 years. Can you get me out of this fix? And what he said was that as an architect, you often go to an architect because you have a dream. You have always wanted to have a new kitchen. You've always wanted to build a new library for your community. You've want to build the tallest building in the world, whatever, but you have this dream. And we as architects have that skill set to be able to help people realize that dream. We're problem solvers at heart, but at the same time, there's an element of us who are dreamers. That's probably one of the reasons why I got into architecture, is to help people to realize their dreams.
That's a wonderful way to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Peter, for talking to me.
It's been my pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to Architecture's Political Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it informative or at least entertaining. If you like what you heard, please share with others. You can also connect with Archis Poly on social media, currently on Instagram as well as Facebook and Twitter. For more information, visit us on our website. It's archispoly.online. ARCHIPOLLY.online. I also want to thank our loyal supporters who have been with this podcast for at least 3 years. It means the world to me, and I'm totally grateful to have you part of this community. I will try to bring you the best content as possible, and I can't wait to share more amazing episodes with you. If this is your first time listening, or just like a particular episode, or all of them, you can support this podcast by going on glow.fm/archispoly. Again, thank you for your support. It means the world to me, and thank you so much for listening.